This next session is going to introduce three different professionals, and we have given them a kind of the very same task. We've asked Tessa Jackson, director of the Iniva, Institute of International Visual Arts from the UK, to join us. Osei Bonsu, who's an independent curator and writer from Ghana. He's working in and out of Ghana, in and out of London. Basically, the last 3 months, he's actually been in Venice, but he's using London as his international hub. And we had asked Maria Ribas, who is a colleague of mine, and she's head of audience development at the CCCB, Centro de Cultura Contemporània in Barcelona, to come, and we have given them the same task, that is to reflect on how to bring global voices into the arts, how to address that issue. And it will be quite interesting to hear what they come up with. They will each make a presentation, then they will be asked to sit down. And after that, we will have a Q&A with you, and then we will go into the workshop session. So please welcome Tessa, Osei, and Maria. You start. Yeah. We've asked Tessa to start, so please, Tessa.
Do you want to sit?
The other way.
Yeah, that would
I'll stay here.
That would be a good idea to see what I'm doing. Yes. Okay. Good afternoon. And I'm pleased to see people have got chocolate cake in front of them just to give them a bit of energy at this point. And knowing I was speaking in the afternoon after a number of other key presentations, I've decided to keep what I'm going to say quite sort of direct, straightforward, even simple. Because how you promote new voices, as we all know, can take a number of different directions. And I think it might be worth... I think it's interesting in this, where we are now, there are artists from all over the world wanting to be noticed, wanting to be in their local biennial, in a biennial across the world. And this is just a map of some of the ones that we all know exist. But in terms of new voices, I just wanted to say what I feel I might describe as a new voice. It can be a young artist such as Nina Mangalayam, who I showed recently at Iniva in London, who is undertaking an MPhil, has presented work, but in presenting at Iniva, it was her first sort of major presentation in London. She has a Danish mother, a Sri Lankan father, and was brought up in Sweden. And so for me, she's an emerging voice, and is about to complete her MPhil, and I know she's got some exciting shows coming up. This, on the other hand, is a different kind of new voice, a new voice to some. It's Abdoulaye Konate, who lives in Mali, is head of the art school there. He's a man who studied in Cuba, also Russia, returned to his native Mali, and found that paint and canvas were not easy to come by, and so started to work with cotton. Mali is the second largest producer of cotton in the world. And for many people, when I first showed him in 2005, he was a new voice. His voice is quite an experienced voice, but I think it's interesting how artists come to our attention at different times. And I just come on to a different kind of voice. This is Lorries on the Silk Road. This is in Kyrgyzstan. And these are two artists who work together, Gulnara Kazmilyeva and Muratbek Jumaliev, who I would also say are new voices. They are voices who are working away in Kyrgyzstan, deciding not to be part of the Union of Artists, and have been involved in creating a new platform for younger artists in Kyrgyzstan, and have been very keen to get their voices heard beyond Kyrgyzstan. So I think how do we get new voices heard can mean many different things, and it depends who you're talking about. I don't particularly use this phrase very often, but as a curator in terms of making shows, working with artists, which I've done for many years, I think it's interesting what you decide your approach is going to be. You may be selecting very different artists, you may be dealing with very different subject matter, but I think for me what's fundamentally important is to show artists in an appropriate context. What is right for them and their work. And you only know that after some degree of discussion, perhaps getting to know them over several years before you actually present their work. And this is an artist Kimathi Donkor, who's based in London and is a history painter, a painter that is presenting issues as he sees them now, but often through historical imagery and antecedents. And as a new voice, we showed him at Iniva a couple of years ago. It's very interesting, the discussion around his work, and we very much chose to show him, partly because we saw him as a fine painter, but also to generate the kind of discussion for the audiences that we have coming into the building. I don't know if anyone recognizes this particular image, but it was the death of a young Brazilian man in London who got fired on in the underground with the police suspecting he was a terrorist. He wasn't a terrorist, he just happened to be carrying a rucksack in a way that the police had described to each other was the person they were looking for, and he was killed. And it caused, rightly in Britain, a huge amount of debate because our police don't normally carry firearms. And the whole notion of war on terror became a major discussion point. So an artist responding to this, but this is in a series of works where he's looked at the fallibility of the police, and that's putting it politely, but the difficulties within the black community of the role of the police. When I say I try and make sure that the context for artists feels appropriate, this is the work of N.S. Harsha from India, and the building that I work from sits in the East End of London, which is very much an area of the city where migrants have come to seek work over centuries. And Harsha's work, this is a piece called Nations. It's 192 manual sewing machines, and the 192 connects with the number of countries in the UN. Draped across each sewing machine is a painted piece of calico, and the calico denotes the different flags of the 192 countries. What was interesting about this work was partly the discussion that came about because Israel just happened to get put down next to Syria by no design at all, but also by the fact that in the East End of London, and Brick Lane, many of you will have visited, is where the sort of sweatshops, the clothing industry has been for many years. And so having a piece like this in our main gallery, and as you could see, if I can go backwards, we have a fantastic street presence. Women coming in saying, I spent all my life next to one of these machines. And for me, it's the conversation that the artist is having around perhaps political, social issues, but who are you having a conversation with? And I think, how do you promote new voices? Well, I think it was Paul mentioned the word relevance. The conversation is immediately struck up if the discussion feels relevant. Because I would often say as a curator, often I'm working with artists whose names will not be known other than in a very particular art world. The other thing, I think, is how you sometimes place artists together. I don't tend to do sort of country shows because I don't feel that's particularly helpful to the individual artists. But what I will do is often place artists next to each other. This is Chen Jiren from Taiwan in the building at the same time as Harsha, the previous work, because he is also talking about the textile industry. He's talking about what happens when those industries close down. Taiwan, often the producer of cheap goods, became the place where it was more expensive than China. So all the industry, or much of its industry, moved across to China. So what does that mean for the people left behind? But Chen Jiren is now a very well-known artist, but I'm really using him to illustrate the point. And I think it was the conversation that we were able to have locally with these artists and their work. As a curator, how do you promote or find new voices? I don't think you ever really discover anybody. What you do is try and keep your eyes open. You go and see a lot. You travel when you can. But I also, as we all do, what's important is talking to colleagues. Here I was working with B.C. Silva from the Centre for Contemporary Art in Lagos, and Isabel Carlos, who was then an independent curator but has just finished working at the Gulbenkian in Lisbon. And I'll come on to the project in a minute, but I think it's trying to expand the kind of conversation you have rather than your immediate cronies in the London art world. This is the building that I currently work from, and I'm only working from until Friday when I leave, because I think it's interesting as a curator, you feel you can have different conversations in different places. You can promote artists in different ways. But this organization has an extraordinary history. The Institute of International Visual Arts came into being about 21 years ago after campaigning and strong vocalization by artists, curators, academics, and others who felt, as black artists, Asian curators, or whatever, that the issues that they wanted to discuss, the discussion of identity that was so important in Britain, was not being had in London by our major museums and galleries, including the Tate, and was not being had very readily regionally, although there are some shining examples where the conversation was had with Sheffield, with Wolverhampton, who actually decided to promote new voices at a time that nobody else was doing so. So it's interesting that public policy of how do you deal with cultural diversity came from new voices, came from those very people campaigning. And I think I and my colleagues at Iniva now are very aware of that, and that we live in contested space, and it means we often have discussion and argument with a wide range of people beyond Iniva as to what we're doing, and I think that's right and proper. So Iniva came at a time when Britain was becoming aware of the change in its communities. First generation, second generation, maybe third generation individuals feeling as artists that their work was not being looked at. And this is Eddie Chambers. The work was called The National Front, but I also see it as a symbol of Britain breaking up into a different form. This is Yinka Shonibare, very well-known artist now, but a new voice at the time, he's the man dressed in the suit. This is a diary of Victorian dandy. He did a series of photographs through the day, always himself being the Victorian dandy, surrounded by others, all white, turning on its head who he was and how he was seen in society. And these works were commissioned by my organization. I can't take the credit, but I think it's a fantastic project which they put across the London Underground, and it had significant effect. So promoting new artists, I think it's where you do it. You maybe do it in places that are not always the norm. Just to say a little bit about Iniva, one thing that the organization's particularly done over the 21 years is to establish a library, very much a living library, to look at non-Western art. So it's about the exploration of a range of art histories, and that's been extraordinarily important to museum curators, artists, for source material, for thinking about how they conduct their own work. It's also been an important organization for publishing, and I think when we talk about new voices, what is so important to many young artists is how they're first seen in print, how they're described, how they're critiqued, and how we all do that as institutions, because it does tend to be institutions that are able to publish. I think for Iniva, it's done a whole series of different publications. These ones in particular were looking at art history afresh from different voices. I'm going to move on to another organization which I was involved in called Artis Mundi, Arts of the World, which was a big international initiative that my chairman and a team set up in Wales. And we set it up when Wales had a greater degree of independence. There was devolution in Britain in 1999, and in 2002 we got together to found an international project that would bring the local and the global together. And it was quite carefully designed, but involving a huge range of people from those based in Wales to selectors. In fact, B.C. Silver and Isabel Clarlas, that earlier photograph, they were two selectors. And each time we had selectors from different parts of the world who'd never met each other, who came together to work on the project. We'd have a series of judges. The first chair of the judging panel was Okwe Mwiza. I was absolutely amazed he said yes to coming to Wales. But what was fantastic was just getting a huge mix of people coming, looking at what was happening, seeing also a range of international work. And often those artists at that time were not particularly well known. This artist is extremely well known now, Xu Bing, but he was a voice who left China, went to the States feeling he could operate more successfully there. He's now able to be back in China, but he made for me one of the most compelling works there is around 9/11. And this is the dust from 9/11 across the National Museum floor. I have to say it took a great deal of negotiation to make sure it could happen. But I think what was extraordinary about the project was we did this big exhibition every 2 years. It had record audiences, and most people never knew the names of any of the artists. But it was the discussion which they were able to have. It was the kind of what for them it might connect with in their own lives. That's what was successful. And for me, that was an extraordinary sort of privilege to be able to, in a way, make those connections. I think, actually, I'll just go back. One thing I think is very interesting. I'm now involved in a digital art prize called the Lumen Art Prize. And I think it's interesting how technology is broadening in what we can all do has democratized how voices can be heard, who can be heard where, and often it's those parts of the world where perhaps traveling, mobility is most difficult. That's where the most interesting new voices using digital are coming from. This is from the Guerrilla Girls in Venice 2005, so it's 10 years ago, but I think it's interesting. More countries are represented in the Biennale this year than ever before, but except for Egypt and Morocco, the continent of Africa is missing. That's an astonishing state of affairs for a major platform such as Venice. And so I think when I think about what my role might be in any organization I might be involved in, it is what are our responsibilities? And I do feel there's a responsibility to kind of broaden the range of voices that we draw from. And it's up to us to kind of investigate, see what feels appropriate for the setting we're in, or for how an artist can be shown. And I think in Britain, we have 1 in 4 people in the 2011 census, national census we have, who said that they, in some way or other, had parents or had a strong connection to somewhere else in the world. That's 1 in 4. And I was talking, in fact, to Niels earlier today that it's very similar in Copenhagen. So I think it's interesting what we decide to do with our programs, how a national gallery might collect, how Tate now does in fact collect wider. It's taken a little bit of time, and it's taken organizations like Iniva to prompt it. But I think we really do have to be very aware of our surroundings. This work is by, I'm just finishing, but this work is by Mona Hatoum, and I think it's interesting. As you will see, she's sort of rebalanced the map. And that's perhaps what I feel constantly in my role that I need to do. Otherwise, it's very easy to maintain a status quo and not, in whatever role you play, decide you can present new voices in perhaps slightly different ways. And I think it's interesting that this conference has the word globalization in its title. I mean, there's always a fear that globalization might encourage dislocation, lack of identity. But actually, if you look at artists' work, through the arts, it's one way to absolutely prove to ourselves that that's not the case. But it is who are the voices that we're working with, that we're listening to. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tessa, and we will be able to go into Q&As afterwards. So I will just immediately ask Osei to take over, and maybe you should swap chairs.
Yeah.
So the one in the
Okay
black chair is the one
if I
presenting.
stand?
Yeah, it's okay if you stand if you want to. Fantastic.
So you can all hear me. I think the invitation to speak as part of this conference on art and globalization came quite late, and it actually came maybe a week before the opening of the Venice Biennale. And I hadn't actually been involved in the team of people curating the show. It was mainly an Italian team, people who had been doing it for years, who were part of the Biennale's foundation. But I was there working on a show in Brescia, and then subsequently came to Venice because I was launching a project there entitled Crane. And I felt the need to talk about this, not from such a subjective standpoint, but to talk about maybe the importance of the immediacy of presenting new art. What is the panel again? It's new voices in art. I think, for me, it's never something that I've held in question. I mean, as a young curator, cultural producer, someone who's active in the cultural field, it would be a no-brainer to work with artists who are in my peer group. So maybe I'm coming more from a perspective of it being a very, very commonplace activity that I've engaged in for as long as I can remember, at least professionally speaking. But I wanted to kind of start off by saying that there's no hashtag for arts and globalization, but there should be. And you can also hashtag into what Crane are doing by hashtagging Crane projects, or arts and globalization. And I mean, the reason that's important is because I was speaking earlier to someone in a tent just over there when I arrived. I was sort of lured into this sort of strange space of conversation and dialogue initiated by Thierry, which I was so thankful for because it brought about a kind of interesting conversation. I was just saying how everyone here is in such a privileged position to get the opportunity to hear about these ideas of arts and globalizations, but also to be able to participate. I mean, what we're seeing here to some extent is an international community of people who I'm sure travel and experience art, but to what extent are we a room full of people who are not necessarily benefiting from both arts and globalization? I think everyone in this room in one way either calls it their job to be involved in these spheres, or in some way as a spectator participant in the development of those activities, the making of art and the globalization of art and culture. So from quite a simplistic standpoint, I just wanted to kind of plug you all into a wider world, and I hope that we're live streaming so that that people far and wide feel the kind of urgency to connect into this dialogue, because so many of these conversations are extremely urgent, like I mentioned. So, I mean, what is Crane and where did it begin? Well, I think, and also to thank you guys for the platform, I mean, all of the donors in Arts and Globalization, and Ricky for hosting, of course. But where did Crane begin? I mean, for me, as like I said, the idea of supporting artists in their infancy, I guess you could say at the beginning, in their kind of embryonic stages, is a no-brainer. I mean, why wouldn't you support an artist who needs support? Or why wouldn't you find a way to expose a practice that deserved more attention? It's not that much a cultural strategy as it is a kind of common sense, you know. It's very much a position of common sense to think about supporting those who need that support most. So a little bit about the project, but I didn't really want to present images because I spend a lot of time talking about art and history and ideas, and I thought here would be interesting to present a platform that you could engage with or not, but kind of take up as one that could be shared, because Crane is about a shared space. So really to talk about the website and where it began, leaving Venice, I think this is anecdotal, but it's extremely important. So working on the Venice Biennale, it was interesting because it was covering a lot of artists from around the world, and within all the world's futures, there are I think somehow about 136 artists from all over the world, and a percentage of those are African, and I was privileged enough to be able to write about those who were coming from the continent. But in writing about them, what I realized is that there was, firstly, on writing about African art in general, I mean, it's something that came up in Tessa's talk, but the sheer lack of focus there is sometimes on artists from the world who are considered to be marginalized by economic conditions. I think we don't consider the extent to which the conditions of the contemporary art world are completely about economics. I mean, they're about a deficit of sometimes historical exchange and visibility, but I think more so they're about market powers, and I think this is something that I was interested in addressing through Crane. So we launched during the Venice Biennale at the Navy office, and the idea was to bring together the artists who were participant in the Biennale, who'd been participant in other things like 154 Contemporary African Art Fair and other initiatives like the Dakar Biennale, but really to have a discussion about international platforms for art. So kind of to use Venice as a sort of nexus or a meeting point for that cultural exchange sort of seemed like an interesting beginning. Principally because this year it has a Nigerian curator, Okwe Nwezo, who has a strong track record for presenting artists from around the world. But I wouldn't say exclusively African artists. I mean artists from really across. It's been part of the South dialogue and other sorts of dialogues that were initiated in the 90s and have only expanded into the noughties. But I think now we're left with very, very interesting conditions wherein I think artists are much more visible than they were before perhaps, but the strategic and perhaps kind of systemic conditions of cultural production are not that different from the 90s. I mean, the way in which we promote shows, it's usually a solo show or a group exhibition. If you get into a good group show, then your work may be highlighted. You keep working on those sorts of shows until your work is ripe for retrospection. After that retrospection, maybe you have a monograph, a book catalog gets written on your work. Voila, you're an international artist. Congratulations. So the kind of process is incredibly generic and sometimes to be frank, a little bit, I think a little bit outmoded, mainly because they don't necessarily privilege those artists who are working within the margins. It's more difficult to use those points of contact. And when I talk about the margins or marginality, I just mean peripheral to where most biennales and art fairs take place. Not marginal in my world, because obviously I'm traveling to Ghana very often, so my center maybe looks more like Mona Hatoum's than it does a generic globe. But I think the point for Crane was to start with this idea of what is the potential of the online to galvanize a kind of change, to reconcile, I guess, the art community with the potentiality for growth and change within a system which is, I think, more or less still going down this one route of an artist needing the West in order to present their work internationally, in order to be considered a part of the sort of radar or the consensus. So it was kind of a project about non-consensus, or what would it look like if it was kind of in via Paul Godwin's thinking on creolization and islands and the way in which things are connected through archipelagos. Could it not be more interesting to think of this online space as this geographically expansive space with the potential of being initiated or how do you say it, interacted by artists who weren't necessarily able to physically, geographically be there. So there was this kind of interest in being there, participation, non-participation, not through relational aesthetics or kind of museological discourse, but just merely about showing up to the party, right? Being in a fair or in a biennale, and what were the possibilities of that, and why was it important in some ways to actually subvert that tension by saying, no, I will not participate, I'll create my own center, as we've seen earlier with the previous talk, on a biennale, which is ultimately in a part of the world that most of us here have never been to, and yet through that presentation you were transported to Indonesia. So I think to think about Crane on a baser level, so Crane, I mean, it's a kind of abstract title. We're both Crane and Creative African Network, but as Crane, we initiate local public art projects. The first of our projects which takes place this summer is the Guest House Residency Program. And what's interesting, it's a kind of three-tier residency program, thinking about really the way in which the art world is often three-tiered. You have international participants, usually flying over to make a contribution to the residency in one way or another. They can be artists or curators. We have local artists. This year it will be, I think, one artist, but it will be an artist selected by the University of Science and Technology, Kwame Nkrumah University, which is an incredibly critically important place for Ghana. I mentioned that Kumasi is Ghana's second city and has I think a strong intellectual tradition for the arts, but I think similarly to what's been presented earlier, has often a tendency to privilege art that's seen as traditional and somewhat is established in a certain economy, which usually happens to be art that tourists buy. But anyway, that's another story. So looking at kind of guest house as being this sort of, in a sense, an alternative to a residency, it would be an open space that we can invite people to, but at Crane would initiate it as being a guest house for artists to engage in and within. And similarly, I think to Alighieri Berti's One Hotel would be a kind of context in which art was alive. I think one of the big issues with international residency programs, particularly here in Europe that invite African artists, is that the sense is the artist is there to produce content, or that the artist is there to facilitate some kind of cultural diplomacy role. And I think we're hitting the nail on the head here today, where we're speaking about the pluralities of perspective, the fact that artists look from all corners of the world. And I think the perception that African artists aren't as clued up on what's going on internationally, I think is changing, and it already has changed in many ways. I think through vehicles like the internet. But I think, so when we take it to projects, that was really kind of our initiation for that platform, was to have it be a guest house that was open, and from that we would initiate the kinds of public art projects we've seen presented here, but we'd focus on the kind of nuances of cultural practice locally and thinking about cultural, historical, and kind of regional roots. But this will move. So guest house is itinerant. The first one is in Kumasi. Next, we're maybe looking at parts of North Africa, but it really isn't pinned down to any central space. I think that's a great privilege I have as founding director of Crane, is to not think about the overheads of having a cultural institution. I think the idea of creating soft spaces, or spaces that somehow can move, can be manifold and that aren't gripped to a locality or a specific context or space, is incredibly urgent and something I think everybody should be thinking about more. But then it comes to the network. So the network is, I mean, at the center of our thinking. The network, so Creative African Network, Crane. But as part of the network, what we would do is we would present individual artists who we felt deserved more attention. But through doing that, what we'd also do is invite those artists to invite younger artists to become part of the platform. Thank you. So it started with these fantastic group of artists that we've began working with on numerous projects, but they're really artists who've actively wanted to participate with the platform just because they believe in its mission, which is incredible because Crane is such a new organization, it really doesn't have the budget to compete with other kinds of platform. So we have people like Subaru Moses, who's a writer from Uganda, Ibrahim Mahama, who showed recently in the Venice Biennale and will participate in this forum, and Ephraim Solomon, who is actually a very, very traditional artist in some senses because he actually only works mainly with woodcut and linograph, but is an artist who is thinking very contemporarily about the conditions of political struggles in Ethiopia. But all of them wanted to participate and we'll work with further down the line. But for now, the support they're actually offering is somewhat of a kind of intellectual, creative hub to think through these sorts of questions that I'm discussing. Finally, the blog. We just launched our first blog that focuses on Uganda. Tandy Mbire, who's our online manager, who's both Nigerian and Ugandan, thought it would be interesting to focus on 32 Degrees East and its development. It was actually established a few years ago and actually has taken a lot of money from, for example, or a lot of support, rather, from the African Arts Trust based in London and run by Robert Devereaux. But what's interesting is that they've used all of their support to kind of initiate a really interesting cultural platform that focuses very much on the route between arts and education and the intersection between the two. So Tandy is going back and forth Uganda, really looking at the development and that shift and working more with artists in that region. So for Crane, there are regional curators working all across the continent, and they plug directly into the work we do as a collective. But it's essentially manifold in terms of how it offers new opportunities for people who perhaps aren't visible in the West, for sure. But it's not just about that visibility. In fact, it's about the interactivity and the potential crossovers. So finally, This is our logo. I invite you to look at Crane Projects on Instagram, Twitter, to look at the website craneprojects.org. But I think fundamentally, and I think with every single person who presents here, to not see these as ultimately proposals for a cultural strategy, but actually calls for action, as was mentioned earlier to me in a tent. This idea that it could potentially be that you yourself, if you're active in a field or museum, or you have any kind of authority, as I'm sure many of you do, to think about how you can promote new voices, not because it's some kind of cultural remit or strategy, but because you genuinely believe that the need for artists to participate in a civic society, to be part of a space that is political and to actually commentate on the state of things and the appearance of things is an incredibly urgent question. So that's my invitation to you all, but I hope that you can support Crane in one way or another via social media or any other platform, and I look forward to having conversations with you all later in the day, and thanks again for the invitation to speak. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Osei. And the last presenter will be Maria Ribas from CCCB. Good. Sure. Welcome, please.
Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Please, I just want to start saying that I'm not a curator. I'm not even working anywhere near, well, yes, near, yes, but I'm not working in contemporary art, so I will just like to take you over to a very small neighborhood in Barcelona and explain to you a bit how we work with the people in the neighborhood in the different sectors of art or in culture in general. All right? Just a small question. Has anybody been in Barcelona? Yeah? Oh, great. So I don't have to explain that many things. Has anybody been to my center, the CCCB? Oh, not bad. Thank you. I would like to explain you a bit where is, within Barcelona, you can see the port down here. You see the Ramblas, I guess, if anybody who knows Barcelona will see the Ramblas, which is the line in the middle. The Raval is right on the left of the Ramblas, all right? It's that small area within the old city of Barcelona. You can see the line of the old walls, of the medieval walls of Barcelona. That was the old city. So we are right in the middle of Barcelona, all right? The central part of Barcelona. This is the Raval. What we have there is a bunch of big institutions that have been located right in the center, like the CCCB, the MACBA, which is really next door to us, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, the National Library, which is using an old hospital, an old medieval hospital, the Boqueria Market. If you've been to the Ramblas, I guess you've been to the Boqueria Market, which is really a place to visit. The Opera House, the big Opera House of Barcelona, which is on the Ramblas, and the Maritime Museum, which is down south. It's just to give you a bit of a background of where we are, or who we are. About the Raval, I would like to sort of put you into context also of the people in the Raval. There's about 47,000 people, in a surface of about a bit more than a square kilometer. That means that the density of population is very high. And that's only the people living there, because there's most of the big institutions, there's a lot of offices in the Raval, so there's really a lot more people going into the Raval. The immigrant population, it's up till about 25 years ago, it was mainly from Morocco and Bolivia and Ecuador, but now it's gone over to Asia, to Pakistan, to Philippines, and Bangladesh. There's a bunch of people coming from there, a lot of countries of origin. I wanted to explain to you a bit the relationship of the CCCB, where I work with the Raval. We tend to work a lot in networking. That's the way, at least in our center, the way we work with almost everybody. So we try to have an active relationship with especially the schools of the Raval, but also with the town council, the district that's working there. We cooperate with a lot of the cultural institutions, but also we participate at the Fundació Tot Raval. And this is what I want to explain to you about. Well, we participate in many of the district festivities. You know, every city or every neighborhood has their own festivities, so we do participate in that. And we also let our venue for the school's activities, for concerts, you know, end of school year, things like that. I'd like to explain to you a bit the Fundació Tot Raval. It's a private foundation that was born in 2002, and it's a platform of 60 associations, institutions, and also private people. And we have a common, the CCCB is an active part of this foundation. We have a common objective, which is to improve the quality of life in the neighborhood. All right? That's the main object. We try to work together, really, to ensure social cohesion. That is the main thing, the main point that I want to stress on how we approach what we do. How we work? Well, that was sort of the plan of the Raval. We work in a very, like any network. You put a table on, you have different people. Everybody is equal in that association, in that foundation. Everybody is equal, from the big institutions to the smaller collectivities or the private people who represent themselves. We have the lines of work that we have they have the Fundació Tot Raval is the social and education, all right, the living together, cohesion, use of public space. We work a lot with the district on how people use public space and analyze that and try to work with the neighbors of those spaces to see how they would like that to change a bit. So it's kind of interesting. We also have a line of work which is occupational. You know that work problems is, I don't know what you call it. Sorry, my English is, we want to improve the occupational rates of the people in the Raval, which is that coming in from big institutions, we try and get people in from the work, people who live in the Raval working with us. All right, so we try to do that. Economic and commercial. Most of the commercial associations of the Raval are also part of the Fundació Tot Raval, so that is one of the lines of work, to promote the commercial, but also to analyze data, to the implication of all the shopkeepers of the area. We have a communication line also to promote the Raval, but also to promote between ourselves the richness of the cultural. And we have this cultural line of work where we at the center are mostly inside, which is based on community dynamization, social cohesion through cultural activities, anything that you would think of as in working or in being placed in a neighborhood as the Raval, all right? But how do we work? We do have this festival, this intercultural festival, that has been happening since the beginning of the Fundació Tot Raval. It's a way of giving view to most of the organizations of the Raval. So there's 130 association institutions, schools, artists, and neighborhoods working together to build this festival. It's a social, cultural, but also artistic program, and we show the different aspects of the territory, of the neighbors of the Raval. How do we work? Like I said, it's a round table, everybody is equal. We work together in the different projects. I mean, if someone wants to propose something and work with someone else, you just have to talk it about. and then it can happen, really. And we also have artists and schools joining in and working together. We have, in Barcelona, that's separate from the Fundació del Raval. In Barcelona, there's a working scheme of artists having residencies in schools. All right, so you have one artist working with a school group in a school and then coming up with something at the end of the year. When that happens in the Raval, it's joined into the festival. We also have youth organizations and all people's associations working together. We try to generate all these intergenerational events. And the big cultural institution, we don't usually offer programming. We usually offer the venue, all right? We try to either program with some other collectivity of the Raval or just give for free the venue of our places. There's literary shows at the public library also. There's a lot of theater going on in the Raval. So there's participatory theater between teenagers, and there was one about racism last year. And also we have a bunch of musicians in the Raval, quite a lot. So all of them, we try to program, they try to program themselves in a way that you have this orchestra talking with a choir, or this ballet, talking with those musicians, and sort of get mixed a lot. And also we have an interrelations group of the Raval, which is very wide. You can see that it's 19 different organizations, and they work together, really, for the cohesion and the respectability for each other, all right? And they come together with different schemes. So last November, we had 80 different activities. It was just 3 days, and it was coordinated by the 2 people, by the Fundació del Raval. This is another festival that we have. We have St. George's Day. It's on the 23rd of April. Everybody is on the streets on that day. It's the day of the book, all right, in case you don't know it. It's the day of the book, so everybody is out there buying books, but also it's the day of the rose, right? All right, so everybody is out there. So we do a lot of, it's another program, but we work in the same way, all right? It's just a one-day program. All the illustrations by these, for the posters and everything, it's worked with the secondary school artistic groups, and also there's 2 artistic schools in the neighborhood. So they are the ones who participate in presenting what they think would be the poster. This year for St. Jordi was a 4th year secondary school girl. And those are the organizations. Sorry, those are the organizations involved in the St. Jordi, just in the St. Jordi, which are 90, a bit less. This is part of what you can see: the change of roses and books, but also selling of roses, selling of books. Also activities in the Jaima. That's in the middle of the Raval. There's another Rambla. All right, so they put that, and they do storytelling, puppet shows, reading sessions, lectures. There's a big stage over there that has quite a bit of what different groups can propose. And that's it. I'm sorry. I saw the 5 minutes and sort of started talking quickly. So if you have any questions, I can talk about that and many other events that we have and many other schemes that we have at the Raval. But that's what I thought would interest you to know, this kind of work within from the neighborhood. All right.
Thank you, Maria. We do have time for a few questions before we go into the workshop session. So I will open the floor for some of you. And remembering you that actually you touched on relevance. That was one of your terms, and you referred back to Paul for having done the same. And in this city, resonance and relevance are two of the words that we constantly hear being brought back, that it's about, whenever we talk about the audiences, which we do a lot at the moment, it's about relevance, connecting to the audiences, broadening the mainstream, inviting in from the margins, getting new narratives on stage, new types of performances, new ways of programming. I think you touched very much on the necessity of creating new platforms, the networks of networks, by creating this network around Crane that even is allowed to invite their own networks, and in that way extending it by 20 times maybe very, very easily, which is a very interesting opening. And Maria, you touched very much about how a great number of institutions, and I happen to know the Totraval quite well, so a great number of institutions working together, and even actually working in a kind of job swap solution, so you don't exchange money, but you exchange services, which is also a very, very interesting way of crisis management. Actually, it's a very interesting project. So, any questions to the panel at this stage? You will have lots of time to discuss what they have just presented. Have an hour, almost. No? Would you like to comment on each other's presentations?
Actually, yeah. I wanted to ask Tessa about, is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
That in Iniva's history, has it been difficult? Because I know it has been, but I think for people here that I'm not so certain, but I think from my perspective, you know, I think there's an immense pressure for anyone who's directing an organization that has an emphasis on cultural hybridity, cross-culture, diversity, to be representative the level of plurality that we see in the UK, or the kind of the extremities of well, not the extremities as such, but kind of just how diverse that space is, but that can seem to some extent hard to keep track of. To what extent within Iniva did you feel your role was almost tracking the kind of demographic and how would you say shifts in the ethnic, political, social makeup of Britain as you directed it for quite a long time, over a decade?
No, I've been involved for 5-6 years.
Right.
I don't feel in any way we were directed by politics.
Right.
We were often sort of slightly up against the politics in terms of funding and other such things. I think what's interesting, the history of Iniva came out of a certain set of debates, which was very much about the black voice, and Paul's here, he can contribute if he feels I'm getting it wrong, but black voice, Asian voice, a range of voices that were quite focused when it set up. Over 21 years, the art world's changed enormously, but so has British society and the UK's position in the world. So how do you navigate an organisation that is around diversifying the mainstream? We felt that that was continuous from the day the organisation was born right through. It was about changing a status quo. Now, the range of voices that the organisation got into conversation with, both as artists and as audiences, would shift. Iniva's first 15 years, it didn't have a building, so it worked on the underground, as I showed, in abandoned shop windows, or a lot of different sites, other organisations' galleries. And so I think what Iniva's always been about is putting itself into a position where it can stir a discussion. Right. And I think going forward, we've just gone through a consultation process as to where should the organisation be going in the future. And there was a very strong feeling that as an organisation we should generate stronger debate that connects the media through to what's happening politically and economically, but it's through the visual arts. I think it is quite a difficult role for a relatively small organisation to do those things, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Iniva at certain points has shifted how other people and other organisations have worked, and one in particular is the Tate, which is our biggest contemporary museum.
Which is also quite interesting. We commissioned quite a number of research projects, and when we look into the logics of how different kind of development is actually progressing in the country, it's very often so that it starts in minor institutions. It starts in institutions where you can relatively easily change the composition of the different elements, the curatorial practice, the size of the space, the partners, the network, because it's not a super tanker. You kind of know who you're going to talk with. And when you have a history of success, or there are a number of institutions promoting change by their own example, some of the big ones follow. Is that?
Can I just
please,
add?
yeah.
I think that's right. An organisation that is going to encourage change needs to be fleet of foot and flexible. And I think the difficulty now is we're all asked to count the number of people we get engaged with, and certain sort of outcomes become so important that the organisation is no longer focused or as flexible as it needs to be good. And so we moved into a building, our measurements by our main funder became very different. And I think it's the crisis that we're going through at the moment, maybe crisis is the wrong word, generally in culture, that it's the ecology of different organizations that we require to make change. Take on a large scale can make a certain type of change. Iniva on a different scale can make another type of change. And it is that ecology, but it's also politicians and funders and the organizations themselves understanding the combination of an organization to make it successful.
Great, fantastic. Maria,